Hey everyone, it's Audrey, and I'm just going to jump right into how I've been editing my images lately. Opening up the photos I took with my iPhone 11, I'm just going to swipe through and pick the one I like best, and that happens to be this one. It might not seem like it's much different from the other photos, but if you were to compare to the one right before that, this other photo has the highlights blown out, and that's going to be difficult to edit. I've found that with overly exposed photos, there's just a lot less to work with detail-wise. This right photo, the colors are also a bit warmer, which I prefer. So let's bring this photo into an editor, and I use the Adobe Photoshop Lightroom app on my phone. I rarely use the desktop app when I'm editing photos that I took on my iPhone. That's just a hassle. This is a lot easier. So now everything is loaded. I have a bunch of photos in this account because I share this with my husband, and it's mostly sorted by the type of camera he uses. I just use iPhone, but let's create a new one for this tutorial and call it Tutorial. Importing those two photos I was talking about earlier from my camera roll, and opening up the warmer colored one. You can see there's a toolbar down below, and the first thing I like to do is crop my image. And since I'm posting this to Instagram, I'm cropping it to the proper portrait size, which is 4:5. Not too much, just a little bit tighter with the espresso cup in kind of the bottom center. I also want to make sure I keep this floral shadow. Once that's finished, I'm going to tap on light and then tap curves at the top right of this little window. And you can see this graph pops up with these colored buttons at the bottom. I'm just going to go through this as simply as I can. Starting with this button to the very right, this is the tone curve, which represents the tonal range of your image. Breaking it down into sections, the bottom left side of the graph represents the darkest shadows. The middle represents the midtones, more specifically the darks and the lights, and the top right, the brightest highlights. Tapping on this multicolored button on the bottom left, this is the red, green, blue, or RGB channel. Starting with this, I'm going to place a few points along the diagonal, lifting the shadows, which creates this kind of faded appearance, bringing down the highlights, and you can see that that just kind of brings down those really bright points. And then with those middle points, creating a slight S curve or S shape. This is a common technique for creating depth and contrast by making your darks darker and your lights lighter. You can play around with this as much as you'd like, but too much and it starts to look really crazy. So I'd recommend using subtlety, not changing things too much. Next, what I like to do is play around with the color curves, and unlike the RGB channel, which controls all colors, these control specific colors, red, green, blue, as well as their complementary colors or opposites. For example, under the red channel, you'll see that you can increase as well as decrease the amount of red, which will give you the color cyan, a greenish blue. As far as the other channels, green is the opposite of magenta, and blue is the opposite of yellow. You don't have to adjust all of these, or any of these for that matter. I usually just play with 2 at most. Lately, I've been adding a little green to my shadows, so I'll lift this point here and adding some magenta in my highlights by bringing this point down. Switching to the blue channel, I'm going to add a few more points and bring these down slightly toward the right corner to add yellow to the highlights and midtones and give it a little bit more warmth. That's all I'll do for the curves, but you can play around with this and create your own unique tones. It's all a matter of preference. Tapping out of the curves, you'll see these settings, which will change your image in sort of a similar way to what we were doing with the tone curve, but rather than making drastic changes, these are a little bit more subtle and specific. So for this image, I really want to play up the contrast, so let's increase this a little more. And then the rest has to do with lights and darks. If you want to play with these, you can. I like to set the white point first to a place that I'm happy with. And then I use the highlight slider to play within that range. Same goes for the darks. I'll set the black point first, which is just the darkest parts of your image, and then the shadows to kind of fine tune that. This is always different for every image because the lighting of every photo is very different. But when I'm done with this, I'll go to Effects. And something that I've been liking a lot lately, especially for images where sunlight is involved, is bringing down the clarity. This gives the image a really nice soft glow. I'm really into this look. I think it's very dreamy looking, but that does take a lot of texture out of the image, so I will play with the texture slider to bring some of that back. I also prefer to bring down the vignette in most of my photos, and you can see that playing with this, kind of just sliding it to the left, will darken the edges. This tool is often used to draw attention to the center or the subject of an image, but I think I'll actually bring it up to minimize that effect. There's so much going on. I'd rather the viewer to see everything as a whole instead of being drawn just towards the center. And further down we have the grain. I like adding this to my photos, especially phone photos, because I feel mobile photography can be very glitchy and unfocused at times. Adding grain hides a lot of those technical imperfections, and also the vintage film look. I just personally love it. This varies for me depending on the camera, but for the iPhone I find that I like the size and roughness to be pretty high, and then I adjust the grain level to however I like. At this point, I'm pretty much done. Sometimes I'll go back into the light settings and fine-tune the details, or if I want to manipulate the color a little, I'll go into the HSL sliders. And HSL stands for Hue, Saturation, and Luminance. Most of the time I'll play with the greens, increasing the hue. You can see that if I were to bring this all the way to the right, the greens in this photo look bluer, and all the way to the left, they look more yellow. So I'll just leave it right here. The saturation refers to the color intensity. I'm just going to leave this. And the luminance refers to the brightness, which I'll bring up a little. A few more colors I like to play with are the oranges. I personally like them to look more red. And again, for the hue with the yellows, I like to make the yellows more orange. Since there's a little purple in this photo, I'll play around with that as well. And if you hit this target looking button, the menu will collapse and you can choose hue, saturation, or luminance. I'll choose saturation so you can see I tap on any place in this photo and I can manipulate that specific point and color, drag up and down, however. My shirt isn't just purple, it also has some blue in it. Doing that kind of changes them both. So I'm just going to switch to the hue and bring that up a little so it's more lavender. And then increase the purple saturation. Once I'm ready to export, I'll tap the export button at the top, file type JPEG, and I set this to a custom dimension where the longest side is 1200 pixels. That's supposed to be the max length for Instagram portrait size, I believe. I leave my quality at 100% and then I tap the check mark at the top so I can save this to my camera roll. Before I post, I also like to see how it will look in my feed. Open this up in an app called Preview. You can see all of my previous photos are here. I add it in just to make sure that there's like a consistent color story. I just like having it cohesive, just pleases me aesthetically. Last thing I want to share are my thoughts on presets. I personally don't like them. Just an example, I'll copy all of the settings from the photo we just edited and post them to that other similar shot that had different lighting. And if you compare them side by side, even though these photos were taken within seconds of each other, the lighting has caused two very similar photos to edit differently. So imagine the difference if you were to use the same edits with a DSLR camera, another phone, a raw image rather than a JPEG like I have here. All of those differences matter, so I like to understand how to edit my own images for the camera I'm using, the lighting situation, the mood I'm in, and I encourage others to do the same. I love editing for fun. It's much more than just adding a filter. I hope you found this tutorial helpful and that you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, please let me know, and I will see you in the next video.